Well, as you all know, all the Florida games got canceled last week because of Hurricane Irma, and unfortunately, Brandon and I had to take off to make sure our families and ourselves were safe. But we're back for week 3 of college football.
One of the biggest moments last week was when Baker Mayfield planted the Oklahoma flag on the 50-yard line of Ohio State, becoming one of the most memorable post-celebrations in college football history.
I don't know how Urban Meyer felt after that, but I wouldn't feel too good.
He was crying over Papa John's.
And that's why we call him Urban Crier here at the University of Florida. But anyway, we were going to cover Miami and Florida State this week. That game has been postponed until October 7th, so we'll have that later for you in the season. But for now, you're watching RedZone to EndZone. I'm Janae Muchmore.
And I'm Brian Williams.
Our first matchup this week is number 3 Clemson, who's traveling to number 14 Louisville.
It's going to be a battle between quarterbacks of Kelly Bryant and Lamar Jackson.
And now for Clemson, Kelly Bryant has been an effective dual quarterback so far. He has 417 yards passing at 68% completion. But he's also the lead rusher with 160 yards for 3 touchdowns.
Though when facing competition, he seemed to struggle against Auburn last week, as he was only able to gain 218 yards during the game.
But he has 3 great receivers actually. Ray McLeod being number 1, who's put up 105 yards.
And then he also has Hunter Renfrow, who caught 11 balls for 78 yards.
But the other one is Deon Cain, who, although he's only got the ball 4 times, he averages 24 yards a reception. That's pretty good. I think he might be a secret weapon that they can utilize if they need to.
Well, they're going to be playing a pretty stout Louisville defense.
And they're the second run defense in the nation right now. They're only allowing 34 yards, but we have to take into consideration that they played North Carolina and Purdue, who both relied on passing.
They also average allowing 372 yards a game and 31.5 points per game.
And their secondary has had 3 interceptions thus far this season, with Stacey Thomas, Chuck Williams, and Treshawn Smith all having 1 each.
This actually may be misleading, though, because they allow 338.5 yards passing a game, which is a pretty big problem when you're facing Clemson.
Well, the big question here is Kelly Bryant, as a freshman, still has some developing to do. So I think if the defense can get on him and get that pressure on him early, not give him enough time, they may be able to come out on top here.
That may be a problem, though, because Louisville's secondary allows the opposing quarterback to throw for a 65.3% completion rate.
771 yards in 2 games. That's Lamar Jackson for you.
He is also the team's leading rusher, which actually makes him a dual-threat quarterback and obviously one of the most entertaining players in college football.
And he could be going for a consecutive Heisman Trophy, which has only been done once before, and that was by Ohio State's Archie Griffin back in 1974 and 1975.
Well, he has some pretty good targets. He has 6'4" Jalen Smith, who has 17 receptions and 300 yards already this season. He also has Des Fitzpatrick, who's also one of his favorite targets, with 173 yards and 8 receptions.
And although Lamar Jackson is the leading rusher, he does have Malik Williams in the backfield that he can rely on, who's touched the ball a total of 13 times and has run over 149 yards.
The only problem with this? This offense is meeting a defense who only allows 4.5 points per game.
That's pretty impressive. And Clemson is ranked 2nd in overall defense, but they should really be 1st. They're only behind the Air Force Academy, which has only played 1 game, and that was against VMI. They allowed 95 yards that game.
The defensive line was a question last week, but they completely shocked the college football world as they entered the game with 0 sacks against Auburn, but somehow found a quarterback 11 times last week.
Doran O'Daniel was the leading tackler on the team last week with 18 tackles total this season.
Though the big guy in my book, Austin Bryant, who had 4 sacks by himself last week. This is made even more impressive by the fact that Clemson has not even caused a turnover yet this season.
Well, Louisville will be the first big test Clemson faces as far as defense goes. Brandon, who do you think is going to win this game?
Well, I have Clemson winning this game because I think that they have an offense and they can exploit the Louisville defense. They also have had really close calls, Louisville, against Purdue and UNC, and I don't think those two are really good schools. So anyway, I will pick Clemson because I think that they have the capabilities to do better.
I definitely think Clemson is much more balanced on offense, but will Louisville's defense be able to keep up with the Clemson offense? If they can, then I think Lamar Jackson is going to steal the show and allow the Louisville offense to get ahead. So I'm going to go with the Louisville Cardinals. Well, Hurricane Irma is still affecting some of the Florida schools, but it looks like number 23 Tennessee is going to be coming to Gainesville for number 24 Florida.
A bitter rivalry between the two schools as Florida had won 11 straight until last season, where the Tennessee Volunteers came back big for an upset in their own house.
Now, if we could go back to 2015 when Will Greer brought us the win when we were down by 14 with 2 minutes left, that would be perfect. But I'm not holding my breath for that. This kid at quarterback, Quentin Dormandy, he is amazing. He had an amazing first career start against Georgia Tech, came back from that 14-point deficit in the fourth quarter, not in 2 minutes, more like the entire fourth quarter, but he came back and took them into double overtime and came out with the win. And he has 415 yards passing already.
This is made a little more impressive by the fact that Tennessee has yet to have majority of ball possession. This includes their game against Indiana State.
But his favorite target is Marquez Callaway. Callaway has 152 yards passing for 3 touchdowns at 40 yards a pass. That's pretty impressive. The Gators are going to have to stop him.
John Kelly is their leading rusher for Tennessee with 208 yards and averaging 5.6 yards per carry. He's a predominant force on the ground. The Florida defense displays a bend not break attitude, allowing 433 yards total, but you can only say that the defense was responsible for 26 points last game because Malik Zaire fumbled in the touchdown, and I don't think you can hold that accountable for the defense being cause of that touchdown.
And as long as they show up, I think Florida might be fine. I mean, we've been thriving on defense the last 8 years or so. But they have to show up and they have to play 4 quarters. They came out really strong against Michigan, had 2 pick sixes back to back, giving them the edge into halftime at 17-13. But then no one showed up, offense or defense, for the second half, and Michigan got away with the win.
The defense was actually very impressive in their ability to penetrate the backfield as they got 5 sacks against Michigan.
They did, and David Reese led that with 11 tackles, and Nick Washington closely behind with 9. Chauncey Gardner responsible for 2 of those tackles for loss.
Well, what do you think about the Gators' offense?
I don't know what offense you're talking about, Brandon. That's how I feel about the Gator offense.
The big problem was that the offensive line actually crumbled with allowing 6 sacks against Michigan, which is actually one of the highest in the nation.
Well, and everyone was thriving about how great this offensive line was, but I was the only one skeptical of it, and they've got to protect the quarterback. There's no way Zaire should have had a fumble in the end zone. That is just embarrassing. But anyway, between Malik and Felipe Franks, who do you think came out better in Michigan?
Well, Felipe Franks came off as better. He went 5 for 9. He also ran a little bit, but he also needs to learn how to protect the ball. He fumbled on the first down and allowed Michigan to recover, which resulted in 3 points later on. He's also the starter of the future, and hopefully what Florida hopes is one of the bigger players since Tebow. But can he be developed to be the next Tebow through a grueling schedule as they play?
And that is the question. He's going to develop, and he's going to have to learn quick if the Gators want to have a good season. But I think the Northern Colorado game getting canceled is going to, hinder that growth, because that would have been a good opportunity for him. That would have allowed him to get some mistakes but still get an easy win under his belt. But now you're going against Tennessee, and things are not looking good for the Gators. I mean, I looked on Sports Reference this morning, and we have a list, and I'm going to put this up on the screen for you. Look at all the uncertainties that face Florida as we head into Tennessee. Now, DeAndre Goolsby was on that list. Coach McElwain said today he will return, but still, that's a lot of uncertainties.
Well, one of the most interesting things I read about this game was the fact that Nussmeier will no longer be on the sideline, but he's going to be watching the game from the box. So maybe a different perspective may cause a spark in offense.
I hope it does, but they will also still be down their leading receiver, Antonio Callaway, and Jordan Scarlett, their leading running back. And we really just don't have an idea when they're going to return.
Well, the big key here is also not to turn over the ball. The Gators turned over the ball 3 times against Michigan, which resulted in 13 points. So you take that away from the final score, it makes it 2017, and that may have made the play calling different, and maybe the Gators might have got the win.
And going on to the Tennessee defense, they allow 328 rushing yards. So if the Gators want to get anywhere, they're going to have to rush the ball, something that they did not do effectively against Michigan. They had 11 rushing yards. That's just pitiful, with Malik Zaire having negative 24.
Well, Tennessee actually has a good linebacker core, at least tackle numerous wise, with 28 tackles with Colton Jumper and Cortez McDowell with over 20 tackles.
So, Brandon, going into this game, I know in our reactions earlier this week, you picked Florida. Why'd you pick Florida?
Well, I think it's actually kind of more an emotional victory. You saw the Gators with the emotional victory against LSU last year and how they ended up beating LSU even though they had no business or no chance of winning that game. And, you know, the idea is that these players have had people affected by this. It's an emotional game. Things are uncertain. Kind of like the hurricane kind of epitomizes the whole feeling of this Florida season recently. We don't know what to expect. And the idea is that I think Florida wants to prove that they're going to be a good team this season. They come out, get the win against Tennessee, and maybe might show us that they actually have what it takes to be SEC East champions.
Well, as I said earlier, I'd love to see a Florida team come out and play like they did in 2015 against Tennessee. I would love to see them get that streak going again because they had an 11-win streak from 2005 to 2015. But my mom's coming down, so I'd really love for her to see a win at her alma mater. But I just don't see it happening. We haven't been to practice in probably 5 days because of the hurricane. It is emotional for some players. I know 60 of the families of players were affected, according to Coach McElwain in a press conference earlier this week. But I see Tennessee coming in here and causing some disruption. I mean, don't get me wrong, it is going to be hard for Dormandy to play in the swamp because it is loud. But I think he might come out on top, and I think Tennessee is going to run with the win here. Texas lost against Maryland in Week 1, but now they're going to be traveling to California in Week 3 to take on number 4 USC.
This is actually one of the biggest controversies of this game, was USC listed their all-time record 4-0 against Texas because in 2005, they played them in a national championship game, leading to one of the most memorable performances in history by Vince Young. But USC says that they are 4-0 against Texas because during the 2005 season, their wins were vacated, so therefore you vacate loss and you never existed that year.
Well, one thing that makes USC such a big threat is the balanced offense. I mean, look at this. You have 302 yards passing a game and 270 yards rushing a game for over 572 yards a game. That's pretty impressive stats. I mean, we're only in Week 2, but still.
Well, they're led by Heisman favorite Sam Darnold. And Sam Darnold has over 600 passing yards, but what's most impressive is that he's completing 74.6% of his passes. But the problem is that he has as many touchdowns as he does interceptions, with 4 touchdowns and 4 interceptions this season with only 2 games.
He's going to have to fix that number if he still wants to be in contention for the Heisman Trophy. But his favorite target receivers are Deontay Burnett, who has 263 yards, and Stephen Mitchell, who's farther behind him with 133 yards.
They also have 2 dynamic backs, Rollin Jones and Stephen Carr, who are both over the 180 mark. Jones has 275 yards and 5 touchdowns, and Stephen Carr has over 180 with 2 touchdowns.
Well, and I can't lie, Sam Darnold is amazing under pressure. When it comes to third down conversions, they lead the nation with 74%. That's pretty ridiculous.
Well, they'll be facing a defense that has only allowed 325 yards a game and 25.5 points a game.
But one thing I noticed the Texas defense struggling with against Maryland is that they got beat way too many times by the receivers. You cannot let that happen against USC if you want to stand a chance in this game. So my suggestion, Texas, is isolate Deontay Burnett. If you isolate him and he can't get the ball, you're going to be hurting Sam Darnold's favorite target, and that could be huge.
Well, Texas's secondary is actually very talented. They have allowed less than 180 passing yards per game. They also have Holton Hill, and Holton Hill has a pick six for every single game this season. So he has a total of 2. Maybe he might get another one. Who knows?
He might. And especially when it's Sam Darnold who has as many touchdowns as interceptions. But their running defense has an average of allowing 152 yards a game. So that's not terrible.
They have Malik Jefferson, who is an emotional leader, who has already totaled 16 tackles this season. So will he be able to rise up and take the role and lead these young horns to a victory over USC?
Well, the big question for this Texas offense is, will Shane Buechele return after suffering a contusion in his throwing arm in Week 1? If he doesn't, Sam Ehlinger will return. But he had a pretty decent start last week against San Jose State with 222 yards for 1 touchdown. But it's San Jose State, and now you're going against the 4th team in the nation.
Well, they have a talented duo of wide receivers with Foreman and Himful Maps, who have combined for 20 catches and 224 receiving yards with 2 touchdowns.
And surprisingly, they have a very strong offense, ranking 15th in the nation with 548 yards a game and averages 48.5 points per game. Like USC, they have a high third down conversion rate, only it's at 58% opposed to the 74% that USC has.
They have a huge playmaker in Chris Warren III, who has nearly 200 yards on 22 carries and caught the ball for 4 times for a total of 42 yards.
But how does this offense stack up to the USC defense, Brandon?
Well, overall, the USC defense has only allowed 27.5 points per game and allowed 350 yards per game.
They also have trouble penetrating the line, only getting 1.5 sacks per game. That's not that much. I think they're going to have to step it up here against Texas.
Well, their secondary is actually very talented, only allowing 133 yards per game, and they have had 1 player intercept the ball, which needs to pick up. Marvel Tell III, who had a pick 6 for USC, and this was the only turnover forced by USC.
But their rushing defense still needs a little bit of work. They allow 216 yards a game. This puts them at 109th in that category, and it's basically the Achilles heel of this team.
Well, I'm going to have to pick the USC Trojans in a landslide because Texas hasn't been what they used to be, and really is starting to become a fading memory of what they used to be.
I picked against USC last week, and I really thought Stanford was going to win. That was a better pick than picking Texas for an upset, and, well, we saw how that went. So I'm going to have to stick with USC on this one as well. I just don't think Texas has the power right now to take down USC. Now, this isn't a top 25 matchup, but I still think it's going to be interesting. Nonetheless, you have the Ole Miss Rebels taking on the California Golden Bears.
Ole Miss's quarterback, Shea Patterson, has been absolutely spectacular, throwing for 918 yards, may become the second quarterback since 2000 in FBS history that throws 400 yards a game for the first 3 games. This will put him up there with Graham Harrell from Texas Tech in 2007.
Not to mention that he has almost 1,000 yards in 2 games. He also has an amazing third down conversion rate at 60%. And his favorite target is A.J. Brown, who has 389 receiving yards.
The offense averages 537 yards, which is the most in the nation. But when you look at it, Shea Patterson passes for 459 yards a game. So you're looking at this and you realize that, hey, he's going to get that chance to get that 400 yards because they're not running the ball. They're just going to air it out.
Well, on top of that, they haven't played the greatest competition. I mean, Southern Alabama and UT Martin, they're easy to get 400-plus yards on. But Cal is going to be just as easy. They lack a defense as well.
They allow 505 yards per game, and that puts them in the 120th in that category, with only 130 teams actually playing in FBS.
And the interesting thing here is that they have created 6 turnovers from their offensive contenders. But what do they do with them? Nothing.
Well, their big problem here is their kryptonite is they allow 326 yards passing, which with an Ole Miss offense that is pass happy, that could become a huge problem for them.
Especially if they can get much needed turnovers like they did against UNC when they got 3. If they can do that, they might be in a good position, but I still think it's going to be a problem stopping the ball for them as it has in the past.
Well, the offense for the Golden Bears has been relatively good. They have Ross Bowers, who's their starting quarterback, and has thrown for 66.7% for over 550 yards.
And Vic Wharton has established himself as a great target, having received 202 yards and 10 receptions. That's 20.2 yards per reception.
But this is actually one of the more interesting stats, is that their leading rusher isn't the rusher they necessarily give the ball the most to. Patrick Laird has 200 yards on 15 carries, and he's only the 3rd most utilized running back on the team.
Well, their offense as well has gained over 450 yards a game, also because of the lack of defense for the opponents they've played. It could be a similar thing against Ole Miss, who averages 354 yards a game on defense, and they cannot stop the red zone. If Bowers gets in the red zone, Ole Miss could be in trouble. They have yet to stop a single team in the red zone.
The defense has only gotten 1 turnover this season. When you add on to that, they've only had 2 sacks this season as a defensive unit. So there really hasn't been much presence from Ole Miss.
There's really not much to talk about on either defense for this game, but offense has some promising opportunities. Brandon, who do you think is going to win?
Well, I kind of feel like this is going to be a track and field meet. You're going to have them run back and down. It's going to be a high-scoring game. And I have the California Golden Bears because I believe that they have the offense to do it. And, I have faith that they're going to find a turnover somewhere. If they can find a turnover somewhere, Ole Miss is in trouble. But California does have that weakness against the passing, but with Ole Miss and the Land Sharks, well, go ahead and put a beached whale up there because the Land Sharks are beached and they're not mobile.
A win for either of these teams is going to be critical. I mean, they have a tough 2 to 3 weeks they face starting next week. Ole Miss will take on Auburn and then Alabama. But you also have California, who's going to take on USC, Oregon, and then Washington. So both of these teams want to go into that schedule on a high. So it's going to be important that both of these teams fight for that W. However, I'm going to have to disagree with you. I think Ole Miss is going to come out on top. I don't think you're going to see a beached whale in this game.
That's it for this week for RedZone to EndZone.
But if you have any questions that you'd like us to answer on the show, don't be afraid to tweet at us at red2end or message us on Facebook. We'll respond and we'll put that answer in our next week's show. Or if you have any game suggestions, feel free to throw them at us. Brandon and I were talking last week, and I think we had a little cook-off challenge in the works. Is that true, Brandon?
Yep.
So coming in a couple weeks, we have to figure out when we can do this, but we're going to have a tailgate cook-off challenge. So, stay tuned for that. That could be pretty interesting. I don't know what Brandon's going to be making for me.
I have no idea either.
We better figure that out. But it looks like we'll have a couple people out to judge it, a couple of our friends and family. But we'll also put it up online for you. Unfortunately, we can't send samples to you, but you can also watch it and tell us who you think should win. But that's it for this week. I'm Janae Muchmore.
And I'm Brandon Williams.
Have a great night.